James Wilson met Laura Smith one fall day when he was busy with work-related matters. That day, he was at an on-site presentation of a project he was designing as an architect. The presentation took place at a local rehabilitation center, where Laura worked as a physical therapist. It was a collaboration between their companies and a social program to renovate old buildings for medical institutions. At lunchtime, when James was standing at the coffee machine trying to figure out why it refused to give him coffee, Laura approached him. Tall, slender, with dark brown hair and a warm smile, she jokingly asked, "Do you need help with this old machine? I know exactly where to hit it to make it work." James laughed, and Laura lightly hit the side of the machine with her palm. A few seconds later, the machine dispensed its notorious coffee. This conversation was the first sincere and light moment that melted James's tension that day. He invited Laura to have coffee together after work, and she agreed. Their first meeting at the coffee shop lasted until late in the evening. Later, they started meeting more often. At first, they were quick meetings after work, walks in the park or dinner in small restaurants. James began to notice that he looked forward to these meetings more than anything else in his life. Laura was someone who was not afraid to tell the truth. She always encouraged James, but she was also not shy about pointing out his weaknesses. This sometimes annoyed him, but he appreciated her honesty. With her, he felt he could be himself without fear of being judged. Laura also had experience with difficult relationships, and this made her wise and patient. When their relationship became more serious, Laura met Derek Collins. She quickly realized that her friendship with James was complicated and unnecessarily strained. Derek would often drop by unannounced and interfere with their plans. He was friendly, but his mannerisms and jokes had a touch of possessiveness about them. This alarmed Laura, and she began to see Derek as a threat to their relationship. James, on the other hand, did not immediately realize that something was wrong. He was used to Derek always being around and didn't notice how it was affecting Laura. He tried to find a balance between friendship and a new relationship, but the more he tried, the more difficult it became. Laura began to feel that James could not put a clear line between himself and Derek. A year after they met, James proposed to Laura and they started living together. James Wilson was sitting on the terrace of his spacious house, looking at the horizon where the sun was slowly hiding behind the trees. His gaze was empty, as were the thoughts in his head. He was trying to relax after a hard day, but something kept itching in his mind. That something had a name: Derek Collins. Derek had been his best friend since college. They'd been through a lot together: student parties, heartbreak, pennilessness, and then the first steps into adulthood. Now James had everything he had ever dreamed of: a good job as an architect, a cozy house, and a woman he loved. But Derek remained a part of that life, and sometimes it felt like a heavy burden. Here on the terrace, James could finally be alone, but only for a few minutes. Laura appeared in the doorway, a tall, slender woman with long brown hair. She smiled and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" she asked in a soft voice. "Oh, just life," James answered uncertainly. Laura sat down next to him, leaning against him. Her presence was soothing, but the thought of Derek was haunting. James knew that his friend would show up soon, as always, uninvited and without warning. Derek again? Laura caught his mood, tilting her head slightly to the side. James nodded, not wanting to discuss it. Laura sighed and said quietly, "He shouldn't be a third person in our relationship, James. I really want you to understand that." "I know, but we've been through so much together. He's like a brother, you know." "Not a brother, but a shadow that keeps you from moving forward," Laura replied quietly, and stood up to go into the house. James remained sitting on the terrace. He understood that she was right, but he didn't know how to distance himself from Derek without conflict. They were connected by some invisible threads, and every attempt to break them only caused pain. Soon, he heard an engine grumbling on the driveway. James was not surprised to see a black SUV pull up in front of his house. Derek got out of the car, flashing his usual charming smile. "So, buddy, off to watch the sunset again?" he called out as he climbed up onto the terrace. James forced a smile. though deep down he was tired of this obsessive friendship. "Hello, Derek. You know me?" Derek winked. "I'm not one to be surprised, am I?" He took a seat in the chair across from me, leaning forward as if he were preparing for an important conversation. "How's Laura?" he asked, as if in passing, but his eyes were too intent. "She's fine," James replied dryly, trying to change the subject. "How are you?" "I'm fine," Derek smiled, but there was something dark, almost imperceptible in his eyes. "I just wonder when you'll finally realize that I'm the only one who's always been there for you. Others come and go, but I'm always here." James tensed up. He didn't know if it was just a joke or something more, but the feeling that Derek was crossing a line was becoming more and more pronounced. At that moment, Laura appeared on the doorstep. She pretended not to notice Derek and turned to James. "Honey, will you help me in the kitchen?" "Sure," James replied, getting up from his chair. "Derek, maybe you should go home too," Laura asked coldly, looking directly at him. For a moment the air was tense. Derek smiled broadly, but there was no longer any warmth in his eyes. "Well, I won't bother you," he finally said and stood up. "But you know, James, I'm always here, if you need me." James walked him to the door, and when Derek left, he finally felt like he could breathe. "He's not going to change," James said quietly. "Then you're going to have to change," Laura replied and went into the kitchen. James remained standing at the door, looking out at the empty road where Derek's car had just disappeared. He could feel something coming, but he didn't know what it was. It was like a premonition of a storm, quiet, barely noticeable, but inevitable. This meeting with Derek was just the first wake-up call. The tension between James and Laura was growing every day, and Derek's presence in their lives made it even more difficult. James was trying to find a balance between his old friendship and his new relationship, but it was getting harder every day. Little did he know that this struggle would soon end in tragedy. The relationship between James and Laura began to crack like old glass under pressure. Each morning began with attempts to avoid sharp corners in their conversations, but the silence grew louder and louder. James noticed Laura pulling away from him, and every dialogue they had ended with a hint of Derek. His friend turned into a shadow that followed them at every turn. One day Laura came home from work irritated and silent. She worked as a rehabilitation therapist, and usually left work problems at the door. But this time, her mood clearly hinted that something had happened. James was sitting on the couch with his laptop on his lap and looked up when she walked in. "How's your day?" he asked uncertainly. "Could have been better if it weren't for your friend," Laura replied sharply, throwing her bag on a chair. James frowned. "What happened?" "Your Derek stopped by my office. It was just for fun. I guess he wanted to see how I was doing," she scoffed, taking off her coat. "What did he say?" "That he was worried about you, and that I don't seem to be taking care of you as well as I should." Laura looked at James with a hard look. "It's just Derek." James tried to defend himself, even though he could feel the situation getting out of hand. "He's out of line." Laura raised her voice, expressing her anger for the first time. "He's manipulating you, and you're letting him." James remained silent. He knew she was right, but the thought of moving away from Derek seemed almost impossible. They had years of friendship, shared memories, and hard times. Still, he began to wonder if the burden had become too much. The next day, James decided to meet Derek in person. He invited him to dinner at a small bar on the outskirts of town where they used to hang out. Derek, of course, accepted without hesitation. When James walked into the bar, Derek was already sitting at a table by the window. He raised his hand in greeting, and his smile was as carefree as ever. "Jay, finally," he exclaimed as James approached the table. "How are you?" "Listen, Derek," James began, sitting down across from him. "We need to have a serious talk." Derek tilted his head, pretending to be interested. "What's wrong?" "You have to stop interfering in my life with Laura. She's not your enemy," James spoke calmly, but inside he felt everything boiling over. "We're building a future together, and you can't keep showing up at the most inopportune times." Derek's smile disappeared. He picked up his drink, took a sip, and looked at James thoughtfully. Are you really sure this is the future you want? He asked quietly. What do you mean? Laura's not for you, James. She doesn't understand you the way I do. You and I have been through everything together, and she's just shown up now and thinks she can be closer to you than I. That's none of your business, James replied sharply. Derek smiled again, but this time it was cold and almost sinister. I just want you to be happy, James. That's all. James realized that the conversation had reached a dead end. He had known Derek long enough to realize that he would never back down, and this stubbornness scared him more than ever before. James returned home late. Laura was waiting for him in the kitchen, where the light of the lamp emphasized her tiredness and irritation. You saw him, didn't you? She asked, not even looking up from her cup of tea. Yes, James answered honestly. I told him he had to stay away. And what did he say? Laura looked up at him. He said he just wanted me to be happy. James sighed. Laura smiled sadly. He doesn't want you to be happy, James. He wants you to be his. These words made James think. He knew Laura was right, but something inside him still clung to the old friendship. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't that bad, that it was just a temporary difficulty that could be overcome. But inside, he knew it was self-deception. The next few days were tense. James tried to avoid Derek, but he wouldn't let him rest. He called, texted, and showed up at the house. One day, James even found him in their yard, as if he was just passing by. Laura became even more alienated. She avoided talking about the wedding and eventually told James that she needed time to think about it. This came as a blow to him. He realized that their relationship was coming apart at the seams, and that Derek was the reason why, but he didn't know how to stop the process. One evening, James received a message from Derek. I need to talk to you. It's important. Can you meet me at the old mill? James hesitated for a long time, but finally agreed. He knew that this conversation would not change anything, but he hoped to at least put an end to their conflict. Little did he know that this meeting would be the beginning of a tragedy that would change his life forever. When James drove up to the old mill, Derek's car was already there. Outside the old mill, the silence was as heavy as a stone, and the air seemed taut as a string. Derek and James stood facing each other like two boxers before the last round. James gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists. They both knew that this meeting was going to end in conflict, but they couldn't avoid it. You can't go on living like this, James, Derek began, his voice quiet but intense. I'm only trying to help you, but you can't see that. You're not helping, Derek, James shouted, his patience breaking down. Derek huffed, his smile appearing for a moment, but it was a mask hiding his anger. Or maybe you can't make the right decision yourself. James lunged at him first, his fist digging into Derek's shoulder. Derek didn't hesitate to respond with a punch to the jaw, and in a few seconds they were fighting on the ground. Each punch not only left bruises, but also released years of pent-up anger and resentment. James could feel something inside him breaking. It was not only physical pain, but also moral pain. After several minutes of struggling, they finally broke apart, out of breath and drenched in sweat. This is the last time you'll ever interfere in my life, Derek, he said hoarsely. Let's see if you can do it without me, Derek replied, wiping the blood from his lips. His eyes were cold. Nothing of the old friendship remained in them. They went home, leaving behind the feeling that this night would change everything. A few days passed after their quarrel, but James could not recover. He felt an emptiness that he couldn't fill with work or thoughts about the future. Derek stopped calling and writing, and although James should have been relieved, it actually made things worse. It was as if a part of his life had disappeared that he could never get back. One evening, Laura came out of the bathroom wrapped in a bathrobe. Her face was serious, and she looked as if she had made an important decision. We need to talk, she began quietly, sitting down across from him. What's wrong? He asked, though he felt a coldness in his stomach, as if he were about to be punched. This relationship isn't what I want, she said bluntly, without emotion. I want to end our engagement. His heart stopped for a moment. Are you serious? He whispered, not believing his own ears. Yes, I can't live with the fact that you can't protect me from your past. You keep choosing Derek over me, she exhaled, as if this burden had been on her shoulders for months. James sat silently, stunned. He didn't know what to say. Laura stood up and went to the bedroom, leaving him alone with his thoughts in turmoil. He realized he was losing her, but he didn't know how to stop it. The next morning passed in silence. Laura was silent, and James tried to find the words to explain everything to her, but they didn't come. He left her at home to get busy with work, hoping that time would help them sort out their feelings. When James returned home in the evening, he felt a strange premonition. The house was quiet, too quiet. He walked into the living room and froze. Laura was lying on the floor, motionless. Her eyes were open, but there was no life in them. The bracelet Derek had once given her shone on her hand. Her phone lay on the floor next to her, broken but still working. The last call she had made from it was to James, but he didn't answer. "Laura!" James exclaimed, rushing to her. He touched her face, but it was too late. She was dead. His mind could not accept it. It had to be some kind of nightmare from which he was about to wake up. But reality hit him in the face with all its force. He had left her alone, and now she was dead. As James was trying to collect his thoughts, he heard a knock at the door. He looked up, and his heart clenched with fear. Derek was standing on the doorstep, wearing the same smile James knew so well. "James, I was just passing by and saw the light in the window. I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said softly, as if he hadn't noticed the dead body behind James. "What are you doing here?" James whispered, barely able to contain his shock. "I was just worried about you, man." Derek stepped inside the house, his eyes sliding over Laura's body, but his face remained emotionless. James stood there, not knowing what to think. His world was in pieces, and he couldn't put it back together. Could it have been Derek? He knew their relationship had been painful, but could he have gone that far? Derek moved closer, putting his hand on James's shoulder. "I'm with you, brother. We'll get through this together, just like we always have," he said. James felt like everything around him was becoming blurry. He was standing in the middle of his own home, holding the body of the woman he once loved, and he didn't know who he could trust anymore. James's house was surrounded by yellow tape, swaying in the wind, when detectives arrived on the scene. The two investigators, Detective Brown and Detective Simmons, cautiously climbed the stairs to the front door. The air was filled with the smell of tension and fear, the smell that always accompanies crime scenes. The officer met them at the entrance, briefly pointing to the body in the living room. "Female, approximately 30 years old. Her name is Laura Smith. Her fiancé is James Wilson, who found the body. Claims he came home and found her dead," the officer reported briefly. "Where is he now?" asked Brown, a tall African-American man with piercing eyes. "There's another man with him, Derek Collins. Both say they were friends of Laura's. They seem calm so far, but something doesn't feel right." The officer shrugged. Simmons nodded, making a note in her notebook. She was older than Brown, and her observant eye had already picked up on a few things before the official examination began. "Let's start with the body," she said, "and then we'll talk to the boys." Laura was lying on her back, her arm, which was wearing a bracelet, slightly protruding forward, as if she were reaching for something before she died. Her phone was lying next to her. The screen was broken, but it still showed the last call she had made to James. She tried to call him, but he didn't answer, Brown said. "Maybe it was her last act before she died. If she was killed while on the phone, it should be in her hand or on the couch," Simmons said. They continued to examine the room, looking for signs of a struggle, but everything looked almost perfect. There were no signs of intrusion. The furniture was in place, and nothing hinted at chaos. The only odd item was a bracelet that glittered on Laura's wrist. "Nice bracelet," Brown said, leaning closer. Simmons raised her eyebrows. "I'll have to ask my fiancé if he gave it to me. If not, it might be a clue. Maybe this bracelet is more important than it seems." Brown nodded, making another note. He felt that this piece was more than just a piece of jewelry. Another oddity. He pointed to the living room door. There were footprints on the mat, fresh, slightly damp with dew. "Someone came in and out after the murder took place," Simmons suggested. Maybe the same person who left the phone on the floor. She looked up at the officer. Any witnesses who saw anyone come in here last night? No, not yet. But a neighbor mentioned seeing a black SUV parked outside the house for a few hours, the officer replied. It might have been the victim's friend, Derek Collins. The detectives entered the kitchen where James and Derek were sitting. Both men looked nervous, but in different ways. James seemed overwhelmed and shocked, and Derek looked too calm for the situation. His relaxed posture and slight smile looked suspicious. Mr. Wilson, you said you found Laura's body when you got home. Can you tell us more about what happened? Simmons began. I was at work. When I came back, I found her dead. You said you last saw her the morning before. Were there any conflicts between you? Brown asked. We had problems, but she said she wanted to break off the engagement. I thought I could fix it, but I didn't have time. James's voice broke. Simmons nodded in sympathy, but her eyes remained cold. And you, Mr. Collins, why are you here tonight? She asked, turning to Derek. Derek smiled his usual smile. I was just passing by and saw the light in the window. I thought I'd check on a friend of mine. Quite a coincidence, isn't it? Brown said quietly. Do you know anything about the bracelet Laura was wearing? Did you give it to her? Derek's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained it. Yes, I gave it to her for her birthday. I thought she would like it. It was just a friendly gesture. Brown and Simmons exchanged glances. It seemed that this friendship was much more complicated than Derek was trying to show. After the conversation, the detectives went out on the terrace, exchanging ideas. The phone, the bracelet, the footprints on the rug, it all looks like separate pieces of the same puzzle, Brown said. I have a feeling Derek knows more than he's telling us, Simmons replied. He's too calm for a friend who just found out Laura was dead. And one more thing, Brown added, looking over the notes. If he had picked up, she might still be alive. Or he knows why he didn't answer, Simmons muttered. We need to find out where they were every minute of every night, and talk to the neighbors again. Someone must have seen something. The detectives returned to the car, preparing to investigate further. They knew this was only the beginning of a complex case where every little detail could be the key to uncovering the truth. Detectives Brown and Simmons collected the first evidence and conducted initial interviews. But a difficult task lay ahead, checking the alibis of all those involved and finding out who had the motive to kill Laura. Their suspicions were increasingly centered on Derek, whose behavior was too calm, but they needed evidence that would convincingly point to him. James was the first to come under scrutiny. He claimed to have worked in his office until late at night and then returned home to find Laura dead. Detectives visited his workplace to see if his alibi held up. We checked the cameras outside the office, Simmons said, watching the footage. He was indeed there until 20:30, but there's a 2-hour gap between the time he left work and the time he found the body. So he could have come home early and done it himself, Brown suggested. He could have, but we don't have any evidence that he was home before the murder. We need to dig deeper, Simmons added. Next, they checked on Derek. He said he was in town, went to a couple of bars, and then happened to be near James's house. His SUV was indeed seen near the house, but it was unclear when he arrived there and whether he was inside at the time of the murder. The detectives found a bartender from one of the places Derek had been. He left the bar around 9 p.m., the bartender confirmed, but he didn't say where he was going. He seemed to be a little on edge. That left plenty of time for Derek to arrive at James's house and commit the crime. Detectives realized that Laura was a point of tension between James and Derek. Her death could have been the result of jealousy or a desire for control. Simmons and Brown decided to check their pasts for signs of pathological behavior. They found some interesting facts. It turned out that Derek had attachment issues. In college, he interfered with James's relationships with other girls several times, sabotaging them. He was also overprotective and manipulative, trying to isolate James from other people. He's obsessed with controlling James, Simmons summarized. Laura became an obstacle for him. If he couldn't control the situation, he would have easily decided to eliminate her. Upon returning to the crime scene, the detectives examined Laura's phone again. When they checked the call log, they found that the last call made from her phone was at 9:45, the same time Derek left the bar. She tried to contact James, but he didn't answer, Brown said. Simmons took a closer look at the phone records. She noticed that Laura had called James only once before she died, but before that, she had called Derek twice, and he had answered both times. She called Derek before the murder, Simmons said. He may have been the last person she spoke to. Later, experts found another piece of evidence. Derek's fingerprints were found on Laura's bracelet. This would not have been surprising if he had not previously lied about never touching her, except when he gave her the jewelry. He lied about not being with her that night, Brown concluded. He either had a fight with her or killed her in a fit of rage. With the mounting evidence, the detectives decided to call Derek in for questioning. He showed up at the station as usual, confident and calm. "We found your fingerprints on Laura's bracelet," Brown said, "and we know you spoke to her just before she died." "It's just a coincidence," Derek tried to argue, but his voice was no longer convincing. "You claimed you weren't inside the house, but your footprints on the doormat say otherwise," Simmons added, "and we know you were the one who dropped her phone on the floor to make it look like an accident." Derek began to tap his fingers nervously on the table. "I didn't want to do it," he suddenly exclaimed, unable to withstand the pressure. "She was ruining everything. She was turning James away from me. She was getting in my way." "You killed her because you couldn't accept that James chose Laura over you," Simmons said coldly. Derek lowered his head, his hands clenched into fists. "You are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Laura Smith," Brown announced formally as he handcuffed Derek. "Anything you say may be used against you in a court of law." As Derek was being led out of the station, James stood in the hallway watching everything that was happening. His face was pale and exhausted. He realized that his life would never be the same. The man he thought was a friend had destroyed his world. "It was him, wasn't it?" James asked quietly as Simmons approached him. "Yes, it was him," she confirmed. "He couldn't stand the fact that you chose Laura. His obsession with you cost her her life." James felt something inside him snap. He knew that a part of him would stay with Derek forever, but now he had to move on, even though he didn't know how. Simmons and Brown walked down the hall in silence, leaving James alone with his thoughts. He stood there for a long time, trying to understand how things could have gone so far. Several months had passed since Derek Collins's arrest. The press did not ignore the case. Murder by obsession. Friend turned enemy. The headlines in local newspapers did not stop. James Wilson became the unwanted hero of this story. His name was all over the news, but he himself felt like a shadow of his former self. Nothing was the same as before. The trial of Derek Collins began in the District Court of Missouri. The prosecution was based on the evidence they had collected: fingerprints on Laura's bracelet, footprints on the doormat, phone calls, and, of course, his own confession during interrogation. The prosecutors knew that the key to victory would be to show the court not only the evidence, but also Derek's psychological profile, his obsession with James and jealousy of Laura. "This was not a spontaneous crime," the prosecutor said in his opening statement. "It was an act born of years of manipulation and control. Derek Collins could not accept that his friend chose another person, so he decided to destroy their lives." On the third day of the trial, James Wilson took the witness stand. It was one of the most difficult moments in his life. He had to talk about his friendship with Derek, his conflicts with Laura, and the night he found her dead. The prosecutor and the defense asked him questions, and James felt like every word opened up old wounds. "You were friends with Derek Collins for many years. Did you ever feel that he was trying to control your life?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes, but I didn't see it before," James replied. "I thought he just wanted to be there for me as a friend. I didn't realize it was more than friendship." Derek's defense lawyer tried to show that he was acting under the influence of emotions and did not intend to kill, but the prosecutor skillfully proved that it was not an accidental death. Derek Collins could not allow Laura to stay with James. He wanted to keep his friend under control at all costs, the prosecutor emphasized in his speech. The trial lasted almost 3 weeks. The jury listened to experts and witnesses and studied the evidence. The defense insisted that it was an unintentional murder, but prosecutors proved that it was a premeditated crime committed on the basis of jealousy, and obsession. A tense silence reigned in the courtroom as the jury returned with their verdict. The presiding juror stood up and announced, "I find Derek Collins guilty of murder in the first degree." Derek remained motionless as the judge read out the sentence: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He no longer had the confidence he had shown during the investigation. The obsession that had driven him for years had finally led him to his inevitable defeat. When the trial was over, James stood outside the courthouse, breathing in the cold autumn air. He knew that everything was now officially over, but he still felt empty inside. Nothing could bring Laura back or fix what had happened. Friends and acquaintances tried to support him, but he remained withdrawn and alienated. He needed to learn to move on with his life with the knowledge that his past friendship with Derek had caused the tragedy. He also knew that the loss of Laura would stay with him forever. A few months after the verdict, James decided to sell the house where the tragedy occurred. He could no longer live there. Every corner reminded him of Laura, of their plans for the future that would never come true. Before leaving forever, he looked around the empty rooms one more time. James walked out the door and never looked back. He knew that life went on, albeit with new scars, but now he realized that even his closest friends can hide dark secrets, and it's important to be able to see them in time before it's too late.